당가디 모두 닝두치 벽에가나 휴샤이 단도 전주 페미팅 조기 subject 레시지기요레 디나라 토마 나이 디나라 데오르스 샤노스 아니 조글라 당가 subject 걸 계기 신금에 제상가 디나 디그메스 이내 디콜리시 개침보인자 빈중원들의 나랑 계획군이 튼줄지에 가려나 디인데 이스 랍전에 가장 것만 sabda 속에 같이 찍qabla 나버스 달라고도 sabda 속에서 믹스에 된데 휴치예요 엔트링 거라 단데 디담시qabla 믹스에 기타도 sabda 속에서 정말 배워봐 된데 배도에 줘봐 같이 어디도 왔다 하고 싶지 대체진 따던다 거라 콜라 생닝도 이슈나 그런 달로 망고 공네 다망고에 로이로 된데 지금 닝도 지셔야 공네 다른 매체네 베베기 레히든데라 대바지 중네 되네 그런게 다 잉세나레 다 베발라 가힌세나레 된데 제네 쇼증네 베베 코리우 숭조다 니네 베베기 삽다스웨 된데라 도고 침보체네 로망고 된데 도고 체딩이지 엔 라버드 신신 담바 제르름 부쟁기 에네 표 샤르조기 그 사고도 이제 sabda지 소도나 야고도 살아지네 아니 그런게 디스여지네 단다 international campaign for Tibet 콘조에게 양들에 된 sabda 망부지 그런 것을 이래체제네다 롬 망보다 로 가시든데라면도 점구로 부지 오면 제가 쉬든데 제제 유령 부지 답변하게 내든지다 하고도 단다 닝에 해오디가라 믹스에 콜레네 제대게 지레샤 아니 가장 그런 게 뭐시 뭐 도구지기 대사로지 되네 대 사로스나 대든 것만 된 저래샤 대하고 쉬우지도 근데 대 가시지 변조를 힌드 잡으러서 랍진에 그런 키니 레샤 두둥에 그런 게 제티네 그런 게 잠정도 하고 인자 또저런 두대시라면은 아니 담히지 나오러 나슬랍네 그런 가병은 해시나네 엔트링 공대 배에데 또 좀제 도든데 지그래 아니 다 sabda싱데 지당에 망고싱이 말해데 미 망고치기도 스타 탭티 샤오다 된데스 로인데 휴지 내가 침부지기도 와 고양 빼데 그런 다 디자인도 오지 자침부 휴지 유딩이지 아니 ngo마 미드서 이나다 소소 텐솔랑에 쳐도 사자도서 모다 쳐에다 맞이 된다라 직배강을 티에서도 다 신기강을 티에서도 되네 림베 슈구강을 꼬에서도 베버랑게 sabda도서 치지티샤오 먹고지 락비티샤죠 된데 딱다 요마르다 로로롭체네 강달 된데제네 다 루주 망고시도 왔다 띵사 sabda도서 페페다고 소도고요 그래 아니 단다 구글기 sabda도서 이나 아니 파게 나글치네 직 거라페 다도네 직 땡용데 할람 강바레다 디나게 미드서 시트행 멘도 삼바로 된데 땡도 와 나타마치 구글 파게 헤드쿼터에 치네 뒤두콘데 땡소와 히우지도 와팅사 대주디 단단한도 GPS 표초당에 두슬이 싫어야 그래서 GPS 두슬 표초당은 펜도고요래 사진 찍는 찍을 도에 딱딱 독수리에 랍그레 마도게 디에는 코리우 가르도 여러분 샘진 가르도 강발 가르도 다 힙사고 전에 소소한 게 게르기 냠용사는 도에지어와 그래서 큐르 된다고 말했어 sabda 약보 유용해지나 sabda 미교 거라 sabda 센데 찍지는 욕도 세월에 세월도 찍지는 욕도 세월 말에 딱 되어서 그랬어 레로부터네 거든데 그 sabda 다가란 돈에 주요지에다 에네 sabda 돈에 즉 돈나지 인식이지나 sabda 돈에 som로 구양보다는 자체보다는 알레 롱보데 대차도 알레 추디 대차도 리드 대도와서 근데 즉 sabda 다나 자체보히나 디제기 통자토제 체른도에 다 충종으로 지해봐이나 변 드럼사기 이용 그 sabda도다 야구지 해봐이 근데 제가 올라면 출로 쇼리에다 메쇼리에다 따스인데 사용 년가세 모여봐다 근데나 즉 배우고 정말 사토사데 가와레샤 가와 배우고도 세도 상마 싱그레세 sabda 디히 잡도 근데 잡고도 와 근데 마싱해지 있나 내가 출로 잡 년가세 뭐 정나네 모바일 폰데 남라 차 대 모더기시 모바일 폰데 내가 맞아지 근데 그다 강에 먹고지 뭐 bombede와 출로 쇼데 중송아 자도 수수 숭조 제 차례 있네 근데 두고 말했어 근데 시에도 와 디시도 거기서 그렇고 먼저 지당 먼저 미래 락버드 먼저 단다 sabda 믹스에 도나 쟁에서 망스 로고에서 게 되나 다 로에게 조자 망고도 와den서 망스 로는 subject 구매 카리임바 펜도 카리요와 락버드 페베 subject 디케시 모임바 그러와 다 페베기 게다 이게다 리슝도 제바 점에도 당신베 갑들라 애니 페베기 투모 마임베기 체주 천지 다 sabda 제바 기획도 제바 차상 돈 수줍 제도베지 고고여와 어떤데 차네네 sabda도 베 계정 붙여게 요레스 하루와 pen 미리직 소 고고요나 the engineering cohesive of the community segre meri de ko chigjuri imbegi korangi chejuji yores cheju de ngosimni sajaina tanga simo saja dires rina dires chuina dires semjeina jakob gi semjen dire jakob gi ri dire jakob gi chu dire ro eni ni jakob gi tumo mai khala dire ngando gi he shabru dindere tuglo konda dindere se dozo 상마 지 약보지 ngoshena eni beba 상마 chigjuri imbegi duhide yungdu 직줄 근두시 대시리샤네 아니 소주다 단단한도 베베 네단리나 베베 탑주를 팽거로 와 탑주 팽라 오다 civilization the culture 와 저 딘데기 토네 아니 슈크심부 휴 잡투에지 용거스 딘디 랍기어 랍디 두성 옛내가 전부 통도 락바도 가서 단다 베베기 재미 탑주 지에디 와 당부시에는 soft power against hard power do che de do ngandu ki rishung gi thone ta jamguru chi ka na na hi me lam cham ni ji rwa cheme shewa de thone tabsu che de go pa jo ne se jang chi tu jang chi me ba so jang chi ge de khari ne me ba so jang chi se de thak bu thone wang che be jo da ne che de chi yor wa chi du ta tel ke ja mang go hiu ji le ge re ke ja mang go hiu ji le ne de che na pha ba ken jung gre bes dinde chik che dingin se do samjing je da dinde ro de gal ko cha ta me ba so na naksub ta sha gre se dinde samlo na ge da to mangul le ge so chol ta dinde indu ta da pa de ngod tabso na la phebe ge langjo da de zu tho ne ngod khaw le phias samlo ta yun du ya samlo mangu ta yu de ge chi pe na ngod lungba sho ne de su yung du ta tabso uti de cham gu ru shi ya sama hyu na ta pa ta nya ji gre ro ene so so lungba de che ba hya na su yung 다 콜라자 세나레 원자 세나레 주펜저 세나레 개김뱅이지 딘데지기 내다지는 고조네 애니 이나야 다 찍도 세메시베 람다 펜셈다 튠데다 딘데섬로 자침부 섬로다네 람상 응은세 되면 지르와 땅테면나 딘데 제바 디부들라 로티가스 치인데 다 단데 마시오 치네 법에 ngo야 본지네 장매게 통당 이제 가서 그래 내가 지디에 딘데지 차도요래 제도 조절이 되고 베베기 투모마에 외쳐주고 내당 망부지 해네 대체바이나 아니 단단한 쪽에 배나 계획 송접다 리형 송접 시도 조서 상마 답주기 랭귀 임범마세 랭귀 개첨부 휴지 임버디 대행고도 와 그러와 팀에는 아주 망차지 답주에서 되고 팀members 이렇게 수직 휴는 판이 휴에디 답주 문에 디체 팀members 답주 멤버서로지 다 디체나 간조 랑조다 다 랑조 직부 말이지다네 부자ring 랑조 섬로 당게지나 도선 되게여서 말와 다 텐데서로지 당가 디탐시 제가 용말 당에 들어가 스트레스다 디체도 당 강달 가서래 today's like presenter I was briefly telling them that preserving Tibetan identity has become extremely crucial. It is crucial in general and especially crucial in today's world, and especially at a time when Tibet is completely now controlled physically by the China, right? And we are trying to give whatever kick we can give to the wrongdoings of the Chinese government. So in this connection, every bit, every aspect of Tibetan culture must be preserved, and that includes the geographical boundary. Therefore, mapping Tibet properly has become extremely, extremely crucial. Tandapena sabda society sabda tegas remoji ne sanjam didi reseti so teremdo sabda tinangla phaba khawa degore ro misang khase degore kunzu chegu kharre 사제디나 공부 가세요. 두수 상황 문제 전에 따띵 가서 봐봐 그래. 현다 수강가 말해야지. 따띵 땡고 그러다 차례에 다가나 나한테요. 봐. 어떤데래. So therefore I was telling them that your dedication and contribution towards preservation of Tibetan culture and identity is of course there, and especially you have focused on two important things. One is the preservation of Tibetan environment and mapping Tibet properly. So these two are extremely, extremely crucial. And in fact, His Holiness, in many of his commitments, also preserving Tibetan environment is one of the top priority. And especially what is happening today in Tibet itself, the damming of the Brahmaputra and all those things, ugly things are happening. So I very much appreciate that you readily agreed my request on such a short notice. That also shows your total dedication and delight in pursuing your project. So without me standing in between you and the audience, and of course we have a limited audience here, but it is online, so several people will be watching your talk. And we have until 5 p.m., so you can give 40 minutes, 30 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever talk you want to give.
It might be a little more than that, but...
Then that's okay, that's okay.
I have my eye on the clock in the back. So
that's okay, yeah. If there's some little more time, then we let people invite questions. Otherwise, it's okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Questions definitely at the end.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. I'll be standing here, just a quick logistics thing. I don't have a clicker to change the slides, so I'll be standing here a lot doing this. First of all, thank you, Geshe-la, for the invitation. I greatly appreciate it. And I also greatly appreciate that many of you have very busy schedules and you've come here kind of at the last minute. We agreed to the talk just a couple of days ago. I want to give a bit more biographical information. It's just this slide. This is a screenshot from my web page when I was a lecturer faculty member at UC Berkeley. I retired last year because even though I had 4 months every year to work on projects that interest me, I wanted 12 months. And the projects that interest me relate, as Geshe-la just pointed out, to Tibet's environment and authentically mapping Tibet. As he mentioned, I'm also a human environment geographer, interested in grasslands and nomads, and in also what's called ecosystem governance, the co-management, participatory management of environments and ecosystems. I've worked with Tibetans. This is an image of the group of us in Copenhagen in 2009 at the United Nations climate negotiations. I'm in the back corner in the right wearing a suit, and while I was there I also wore this other suit. That's also me. The environment stuff is another topic for another day. Today is about maps. So going back 3 decades, in 1993, John Ackerley of International Campaign for Tibet contacted me to work with him on a project. The map, I have a copy of each of the following maps here. To work on a project, first, a tourist map identifying locations in Lhasa and in the broader Lhasa Valley, places that the PRC did not want tourists to visit. They sold the map. I don't know how many they ended up selling, but I have since been able to scan at high resolution the maps. Let me show you the other map real fast. And more or less in the same year, Lodi Gyari Rinpoche hired or commissioned a colleague and me to make a map of the eastern borderlands regions of Tibet. I have both of those over here. I'll bring them out later on, and I'll talk about them later on in my presentation today. I've just given Geshe-la 3 pen drives with the digital copies of both of these maps. They're poster sized, and it's to distribute widely among appropriate persons and offices here. These maps, we made this one, the one on the left in 1994 and the one on the right in 1996, and I'm very glad that they are going to become active again. To talk about, to say anything about maps, we need first, and mapping Tibet, and authentic and genuine, honest, truthful mapping of Tibet, we need to first talk about some underlying ideas, underlying issues, underlying problems and challenges. Let me just drop these in here. A, B, C, and D are 4 clusters of topics that I'm going to address first. Something called ecumenes mapping. I'll define that in just a couple of minutes. Historical, cultural, empirical, or real world mapping. And then something that has arisen in recent decades called resistance mapping or empowerment mapping, emancipatory mapping. And then the word topo, or topo, it doesn't matter how you pronounce it, and the root topo and its relation to the word toponymy. The NY-MY of toponymy just means name. Topo or topo means place, so place names. Topography, the graphy meaning description, so descriptions of places and regions. Topology, I'm not going to get into, that should be in gray, I'm not going to get into that at all today. And a word that's probably unfamiliar called topophilia. Philia being the Greek word for love, so love of place. I'm going to spend a lot of time gesturing at that. C is the challenging part, that maps have authors. Those authors claim an authority, and they claim to be authoritative, and often, and too often in human history, especially Western colonial history, those maps have been authoritarian in compelling and coercing a people to believe what is on those coercive maps, those authoritarian maps, whether it's truthful or not. And I've got an example of Lhasa, historical and current of that. And finally, spending a little time with 4 brief examples, 2 of which are these maps that I worked on with ICT back in the 1990s. And then 2 others. One is a book called Siam Mapped, and the other is an atlas called the Maya Atlas from the Mayan people in the Central American country called Belize. I'll touch on those briefly. There's also these 4 more topics about historical European maps that show Tibet. Often those maps are simply colonizer curiosities, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. It's important, the measuring and mapping of Tibet, the British pundits, British India, and other adventurers, and what Jeffrey Hopkirk called Trespassers on the Roof of the World. It's a book that he wrote, people who were trying to come onto Tibet and to reach the holy city of Lhasa, and their history of doing that. There is a book by a British consular officer in 1918 to about 1920, called Travels of a Consular Officer in Eastern Tibet. It's a very fascinating data set in there, not numbers data, but just mentions of places, place names and monasteries and nunneries. I'll come back to that. And at the end, I'm going to suggest that the whole bundle, the whole collection of all of these topics, including ones that I'm about to show here, constitute something that we should be aspiring to, and that is the creation of a comprehensive atlas of Tibet. I'll address that at the end of my talk. Once I've addressed those issues, there are 2 ways that are complementing of each other in terms of scholarship and research and responding to, Tibetans responding to, and also initiating. On the left, Tibet on maps as mapped by outsiders, and then maps of Tibet and portions of Tibet made by and for Tibet and Tibetans. On the left, some of these are in gray. I will not be spending any time talking about those today, even though they are important. And then on the right, again, some are in gray. One of the most fascinating to me is an atlas of the history of the Tibetan resistance. It's a doable thing to document and chronicle. An atlas is a collection of maps about a particular region in a particular time, and an atlas that is a chronicle that uses maps and stories I think there's probably enough writing about it through Carol McGranahan and Jamyang Norbu and others to be able to make something like that. I'll come back to that. I want to start with A and B, and don't let this scare you. There's 43 bullet points here. When I was teaching at Berkeley, this constituted about a month or 5 weeks, and a bit more, actually almost half the semester, of engagement with each of these elements. Now I want to very quickly jump ahead. I'm going to point out 2 of them. This one, the expository mapping, and modern empirical mapping. I want to spend not even a minute on those. Oh, and the important one about resistance mapping is related to the human right to dissent, to stand up and say, no, you're wrong, without threat, without fear of persecution. To speak, the right to speech includes the right to have a map speak for a people. Okay, so briefly, this part, expository writing, is just the teaching and practice of making and designing good maps. It's like becoming a better writer. There are ways to, I taught an entire course at Berkeley about improving ways to communicate geographical meanings through design. Okay, enough of that. This part, modern empirical mapping, is really, really important today. It's a topic for a completely different time. I'm not going to say any more about it. I want to start with the green text on the left and the blue text on the right. I'll get to the gray, the resistance mapping, later in the talk. And so I want to walk through these. The word cosmos in Greek means order or ordered. The universe is ordered. The cosmos has an order to it. We can think of the cosmos of what I do call a people's known world reality. The place, the region that they call, whether it's Kham or Amdo, Uzang, or Tibet, that's their known world reality, the place, the region that they find that is meaningful to them as their home. A second word, the word ecumene. It's technically in Greek pronounced ecumene, but it's like Paris. In American English, we say Paris for the capital of France. The French say Paris. It's a different pronunciation, same word, same meaning. The ecumene is a people's known world reality and how they describe it geographically. Cosmographic, the graphic meaning description, therefore means the described and the named and therefore ordered world as these people know it. It's also, therefore, sacred. We name things because they matter to us as a people. And you should think about this not just today, but 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 and 100,000 years ago. People, modern humans, using language to name places. I'll come back to that in just a minute. All peoples throughout human history have created an intra-cultural language, a language within their culture, within their society, in order to communicate about the meanings of their homelands, their home waters, and even their home skies. We tend to not think about the constellations. If somebody wants to ask a question, I don't talk anymore, other than right now, about home skies. I'll mention it again and again. If somebody at the end asks a question, could you elaborate on home skies? I'll try to dig out a couple of slides, if there's time. An intracultural language to communicate amongst themselves the meanings of their homelands, their home waters, their home skies, their ecumene, their known world reality. And then there's this word topo. Down here, I have separated topo, the prefix, from the root. So toponymy, topographic, topology. Again, that should be in gray because I'm not going to elaborate on it. That's topology. Oh, it is in gray. Topology is in modern empirical mapping. We'll just leave that as it is for now. And topophilia, again, love of place. As I've said, all peoples, all cultures across all of human history, civilizations, hunter-gatherers, early agriculturalists, going back 5,000 years, going back 50,000 years and more, create and use an intracultural language in order to name things, to differentiate them, so to differentiate kinds of animals, kinds of plants. This kind of plant is safe to eat, this kind of plant will kill you. In the New World, this is a quick aside, in the New World, in the Andes, potatoes, tomatoes, capsicum, they're all part of the same plant family. They're called the nightshade family. There's also a plant called deadly nightshade. So to be able to know these to live is incredibly important. To name and differentiate real world and also spiritual world. Tankas are maps. How to navigate an inner landscape, an inner world as you move through it. So as to make intracultural geospatial meanings of a people's homelands and home waters and home skies. They're ecumene. I think I've mentioned these things enough. The other thing here about humans, again, going back 5,000, 50,000, more than 100,000 years, is that we have the capacity for memory and to recount, to retell something that happened, stories that are foundational for navigating across a landscape over seasons, to go to a place during a dry season where there's a known supply of water, to go to a particular place where there's sure to be animals that can be hunted or a certain plant that they want to pick, to eat. A people create an intracultural language to communicate geospatial meanings and to communicate the topophilia of their ecumene, the love of place of their homelands and waters and skies, their known world reality. Topophilia is meaningful for locations, for orienting, where the sun comes up, where the sun goes down, to go in that direction, to go in that direction, for naming landmarks, watermarks. Tibet, if you think about the peoples that navigate across the islands of the Pacific Ocean, they have watermarks. They know how to navigate certain tides and seasonal tides and so on. It's an incredible, incredible history of navigation, and this is pre-Columbus, using the stars to navigate successfully to islands that are hundreds and hundreds of kilometers apart, islands that are the size of McLeod Ganj, and knowing how to get there and knowing how to return, just phenomenal. Topophilia, love of place and naming of place, of naming paths, naming boundaries, naming routes, areas, regions. Mapping, but importantly, not map making. I'm going to differentiate those in just a minute. Mapping now becomes a language for meaningful places and therefore meaningful relations with a people's ecumene, their known world reality, their homelands, skies, and waters. Okay, I've kind of said that. Let's move on. While all peoples across human history and human civilizations have created a language for topophilia mapping and for communicating those meanings, not all peoples have created material maps. That said, this table, which appears, there's a multi-volume, 6 volumes so far. Each volume is about this thick as a book. Let me drop in the rest of it. This volume 2, book 3 of the multi-volume history of cartography. It's free online as a download. I'll show you the links for some of them are in the slides here. Let me drop back into this. This table identifies ways in which human cultures communicate about place and meaning, geospatial meanings, how we do that. Not all peoples make maps, whether it's on paper, whether it is in the green box etched onto a rock, a painting, a drawing, a sketch, put on textile, put on the skin of an animal. Not all peoples do that, but all peoples have a language for communicating these meanings. Which is to say, here at the bottom, a graphical language for human map making is a subset. So these material maps over here are a subset of the languages of and for topophilia mapping of ecumene, of a people's known world reality. Okay, for example, we can identify any number of important, meaningful locations and places and the meaning that a people ascribe to them. The definition of a landmark is kind of pedestrian, but a feature of a landscape that is easily seen and recognized from a distance. Okay, but that says nothing about how meaningful it is. That's just a behavioral, oh, I see that hill over there. Oh, I see Mount Kailash from a distance. Doesn't point to how meaningful it is for a people. Again, these kinds of locations, these landmarks in their homelands, help a people to center themselves, to orient themselves, to navigate in relation to. Toponymy, place names, and topophilia, love of homelands, home waters, and home skies. This is a map that I found on the internet a couple of years ago. I don't know who made it. I don't know how old it is, but I want to use this as a contrast. First, an important point about all maps. When we make a map, there is nothing meaningless on the map. Everything that we put on the map has meaning for a reason. There's a particular relationship with an audience or a message or a message we want to communicate. So everything on the map matters. It's meaningful. To me, that makes it sacred, but that's an academic debate we don't need to get into right now. A young novelist, Tibetan woman, Tsering Yangsom Lama, who grew up mostly in Canada, has written this novel. I'm going to switch my glasses to reading glasses. I'm going to read a short passage. I brought a handkerchief because when I do read it and I think about it, I cry. So I hope you'll bear with me. Hang on just a second. The passage is about love and loss of homelands and waters. The context, it's early in the book. It's about two sisters who have been forced into exile. They're in a refugee camp in Nepal. And the scene is in the evening that the sisters are sitting with intergenerational family members around a campfire, listening to a story. Does anyone know the love story of the river here? Ashang asks his dusty companions. My uncle has resumed his role as a storyteller. The story is about the river beside this camp, he continues. Here they call it by a different name, but the river begins in our country. I take a seat and Moyutak, our neighbor, extends her blankets over my crossed legs. It's as if my uncle were speaking to the river itself, which seems to grow louder, encouraging him to tell its story. A long time ago, there was a princess and a poor boy. They met while wandering the plains and fell in love at first sight. But her family would not accept the boy, so they sent her to the far corner of the country. So far away, it took months to travel there by horse. So far away, she didn't know how to return home. Separated, the princess and the poor boy passed the years, secretly longing for each other. Then, in their old age, they died at the same moment and with the same wish, to embrace the other in the next life. to embrace in a way that no man could break. And so, in the next life, the princess was reborn as this river, and the poor boy was reborn as the hill range that cradles the river without end, an embrace that no man could break. And in the end, they had their wish. Poor things, someone sighs, tossing a few sticks into the fire. I love romantic stories, don't you? Asks Mo Yutok as she covers my knees with her shawl again. Ashang stands and continues the story as he circles the fire. But soon, the place will have Gyami names. Every mountain, lake, and grassland of home, excuse me, will be renamed. Let me restate that, sorry. Every mountain, lake, and grassland of home will be renamed. This can't be part of the love story. Will the love remain the same with foreign names, he asks, shaking his head, with words that mean nothing to our ears? I've typed into the slides what I just read, so the slides are publicly available at some point. Topophilia, love of place and loss of place. These are some references. I'll just leave those as I don't want to linger over this one. Okay, time is okay so far. This is the difficult part because it's the part of the lecture where I talk about the truth of a map has nothing to do with the information on it. It has everything to do with the power ability of a map maker to convince or coerce others that the map's author or authors is true. Anyone can make a map that says anything. It's just map is just an opinion. And until the map has a source of power supporting it and disseminating it and compelling or coercing others to believe it, the map is just a claim. It's an assertion, it's an opinion, nothing more. The truth of a map is in the power behind the map. Maps have authors. Maps assert authority. They make claims of truthful information, of precision and accuracy. A map's authors claim to be authoritative. We know what we're doing. Arrogant. It often has a long history of that kind of arrogance. To be authoritative and therefore correct in what they have included and especially what they have excluded from the map, what they've left off of the map. The authoritarian nature of maps and power imposes on and coerces an audience to accept the map author's authoritarian truth claims. That author's map is also just an acclaim, an assertion, an opinion, but accept it or else. Now, many, many maps in the world don't have that coercive authoritarian quality to them, but when we talk about Tibet and maps, that's the lay of the land. That's the reality, that there's an ongoing coercive power threatening others, threatening Tibetans in Tibet, threatening other countries, that if you challenge what Chinese maps say about Tibet, then you're in trouble. The truth or veracity of a map does not exist based on the presence of correct information. Or worse, based on information that we want to believe, like the naming of Tibet on a map made in the 18th or 19th century. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The truth or veracity of a map is based solely on the fact that the map's authors have convinced or coerced others to accept that their map is true. We can see this in Google Maps. Here's that map of Lhasa again. And again, there's the map in the lower right. This is a screenshot from yesterday. More or less the same region. And we have a bilingual map, but not a trilingual map. We have a map in Chinese and in English, but not Tibetan. What are the Chinese afraid of? What would happen if they added a third language? This is subjugation and erasure. They're not afraid of anything. They're just ignoring it because they're erasing it. It's a dimension. The removal of Tibetan place names is a dimension of cultural genocide. Who are the authors of the map? What authority do they have, do they claim to have, to make decisions about what to include and exclude? And thus, and thus what to erase and what to subjugate in terms of these historical meanings. I'm about to pivot from these core concepts to the 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're on the next slide. I've got resistance and empowerment mapping in gray because I'm not going to treat that just yet. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But I want to spend a little bit of time now with these other 4 topics that I had outlined at the beginning. The phrase colonizer curiosities is a phrase that I actually just coined a couple days ago because most historical European maps that show Tibet need to be treated more as colonizer curiosities than as maps that legitimize the geopolitical reality of Tibet as an independent nation state. Why is that? Besides the stuff about authors and authority and authoritarian, we always have to ask, who is the author of the map? And for what purpose is the author making the map? Who is the map author's audience? These are dull questions, rather pedestrian questions. Importantly, what geopolitical relevance, if any, was there when a map made in London in the 17th century or a map made in Germany in the early 19th century, what geopolitical relevance to an independent nation state called Tibet does this map have? Who authored the map? There's a man that lived in London, died in 1676. He was many things. He was a bookseller and a book publisher. Now, by the 1660s and 1670s, the major colonizer countries, England, France, the Netherlands, Portugal and Spain, there are others, but those are the main ones competing with each other around the world for access to and control over conquerable lands, colonizable lands. After 150 years, these cities started to become somewhat wealthy, or rather, a fair number of people in them started to have an income that was more than what was just needed for basics. They had what we call discretionary income. And Ogilvy, as a book publisher, found it successful to publish large format, and I mean like this wide and this deep and that thick, compilations of maps that others had made. When I was a graduate student, I did a research project on one of his atlases of East Asia, and several of the maps made mention of Tibet. John Ogilvy is not a source of diplomatic stature. He's not a source of geopolitical power. He's just trying to sell books to people. And people would buy them and they'd put them in their room where they invited guests and friends to visit, have coffee or something, smoke tobacco, which at the time was still a fairly new thing. The point is that a lot of maps that we see that mention Tibet, we need to ask who made it, why they made it, and for whom did they make it. That it mentions Tibet does not automatically acknowledge the existence of an independent nation state called Tibet. It's a difficult pill to swallow sometimes, I think. Where are we here? At the same time, there may be maps that exists that do have a credible connection to diplomacy and/or geopolitical relations. Are there any out there? I don't know. I've never done the research. I've just been entertaining that question in the last 2 days. Thank you, Geshe-la, for helping me. These kinds of questions and topics bubble up. What does it say here? We still must consider that some of these European maps, as well as maps made by Tibet's historical neighbors and/or allies like Mongolia. Does Mongolia have any historical maps that show the relations of Tibet and Mongolia in a diplomatic and geopolitical relations, equally recognizing each other? I don't know. It's worth investigating. So I'm not going to talk I'm not going to say anything about the pundits and other Western explorers, nor the British invasion and the maps and geopolitical realities of that in a geographic and mapping sense, nor the Simla Convention. All of those are really, really important topics that need to be further elaborated and put out there. There's an excellent start in this recent exhibit at the Tibet Museum, documenting some of these European maps. Documenting all kinds of maps that mention Tibet. It's a foundational start. I'm very excited about this. And I've met with the director of the museum and talked about some of the ideas with him that I'm presenting to you today. Okay, good. Yeah, carry on. All right. There's an axiom in English. There are two of them there at the bottom. There's an axiom: those who win the wars write the history books. They tell great stories about the peaceful liberation of Tibet, which was anything but peaceful, never mind the Cultural Revolution. There's a corollary that most people don't think about, but which is also true. Those who win the wars also make the maps. This is why we have resistance mapping. The late Professor Bernard Nietzschmann, he was a professor of geography at UC Berkeley. He died 25 years ago or so from cancer. He said, in the context of, he worked for decades with indigenous peoples on the Caribbean coast of Central America. So his quote uses the word indigenous. I have added the bracketed language, and I'll just skip to that. More occupied people's territory has been claimed by maps than by guns. The United States is an incredibly obvious example of that. When you look at the borders of our states, they run east-west, most of them. These are surveyors in 1811 saying, okay, the compass says west. Okay, we're going to go until we hit the Mississippi River, and that will be a state. More occupied people's territory has been claimed by maps than by guns. This assertion has its corollary. More occupied people's territory can be defended and reclaimed by maps. This is the heart of what we know as resistance mapping. And there are 4 examples that I want to introduce, 2 of which are about Tibet, and they're over here. Which brings us to this part of my abbreviated dimensions of human mapping. There was a book published, gosh, I don't remember when he published it. Professor Winnechackle is now retired. He was a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin. And in my first year as a PhD student at Wisconsin, I had the joy of chatting with him numerous occasions about his book and the kinds of topics that I'm talking about with you about today. He's Thai. He was a student democracy activist in the 1970s and fled Thailand to Australia, where he earned a PhD in history. He's written numerous books, including this book called Siam Mapped. Now, the phrase geobody, a history of the geobody of a nation, is not it's a term that he coined, but academically, people didn't subsequently use it. Okay, whatever, that's not the issue. This book, and it's about almost half the book is notes and index and bibliography and so on. The whole story is 150 pages. I'm a slow reader, and I could read it in a weekend. Anyway, the story is that in the late 1800s, the young king of Siam started adopting Western scientific practices and Western city planning practice to lay out streets and to lay out sewers and that sort of mundane things like that, but also training Thai citizens to use the tools of high precision, very localized surveying. Those Thai surveyors eventually partnered with British surveyors to survey the western areas, the western borderlands of the Siamese kingdom, not yet called Thailand, in order to map the kingdom and, in hindsight, in order to establish a boundary. Thailand was never colonized. The French were coming through today's Vietnam from the east, and the British were coming through today's India and Bangladesh and today's Myanmar. But the Thai said, you can't, I'll turn it this way, you can't colonize us. We're a nation state. See, I'm holding a map. It's not a map, but and the British and French are like, I guess we can't. They're a nation state. They're one of us. The Maya Atlas is a book probably between the thicknesses of these two books. It was a project that was born through Bernard Nietzschmann, the professor I mentioned, that quote about reclaiming territory through maps, then through guns. The struggle to preserve Maya land in southern Belize. So the nation state of Belize has Mayan cultural communities living in it. Professor Nietzschmann and his students at Berkeley would go there and help, this is in the early 90s, and help local Mayan people to map their homelands, to map their local communities. There's, I don't know, 40 or 50 maps, something of that magnitude in this book. There's also, it's a really great read if you're into this sort of stuff, and you might be able to find it online. This is the legend that when you open the book, the back cover folds out as this legend, so you can have that legend available for any page that you're looking at. The text is a bit small if you're in the back, so, oh, I've got this. Health clinics, government house or offices, then there's grassland, swamps, highland forest, mountains. So common things that we put on a map, but also historical and sacred places. Traditional healers, not Western medicine, Mayan medicine. And to use the West's red for danger, outside problems are identified. And they're identified with a stump, with a log on the ground. This area is tropical forest, large trees that are very, very valuable. And the Belizean government was allowing private loggers to go in and cut these trees, cut these forests. And the Mayans, Belizean Mayans said no. Here's an atlas of who we are. Here's an atlas of our homelands, our home waters, our home skies. This is our territory, and anything you do in our territory is because we give you permission to do it. Okay. To come to these two maps now, I want to first add, I need to read part of this. I cannot emphasize enough the moral and ethical importance of a people naming their homelands and waters and skies. Because now this is not just an intra-cultural language of identifying meaningful places, of topophilia and ecumene. It's intercultural. The Mayan Atlas is an intercultural conversation, dialogue, but also line in the sand. This is our homelands, it's not yours. Intercultural, using the tools of the people who are trying to colonize, trying to come in and log or do whatever, to say, no, this is a boundary. You cross this boundary with our permission. It's now an intercultural language. Like this. This map is 40 plus years old. Okay. Back in the early 90s, I had already made, I don't know, 3 or 4 maps for ICT, black and white maps for their Environment and Development newsletter. I made a map of the Tibetan Plateau that identified probable locations of nuclear test sites and missile launch sites and so on. And then John Ackerley contacted me about wanting to make a tourism map that was a kind of counter-tourism map based on, at the time, the phrase "on this spot" was apparently a project of some person or persons about, let's find interesting locations in this city or that country or whatever and map them, things that are off the beaten track. In the case of this map of Lhasa, there are, nearly 100 locations that are identified with, some with just a few words of text, but others with 40 or 50 words of text characterizing all the places that the PRC doesn't want you to go, doesn't want you to know about. So on this side is central Lhasa, and then on the back side is the greater Lhasa Valley. And so the 2 examples, the identifying and text about Drapchi prison, for example, and identifying sites related to the 1987 protests in Lhasa. John Ackerley and his really dear friend Dr. Blake Kerr were avid mountain, or they are still, I don't know if they still climb a lot, avid mountain climbers in the late 80s, and they went to Everest Base Camp to just be there and work, move equipment. They ended up in Lhasa. They ended up in Lhasa during these protests. They would rappel into the Jokang at night. Blake is a doctor, and they would try to help the injured monks. So around that same time, the late Lodi Gyari Rinpoche commissioned me and a colleague to make a map of the borderlands region, the historical cultural borderlands region that separates cultural Han China from cultural Tibet. The intention of the map was for Lodi to bring it to foreign ministers and secretaries of state and related kinds of people to say, as we negotiate genuine autonomy with the Chinese, and at the time those negotiations, while they were on and off, there was still promise about them. As we negotiate genuine autonomy, this is as far east as we Tibetans identify the presence of a historical cultural presence of Tibetan language and Tibetan Buddhism on the landscape, regardless of who was controlling it, regardless of how much or how little political control Lhasa exercised over the years and decades and centuries, regardless of how much or how little the Chinese warlords when the empire fell, and regardless of what the young and largely inept Republic of China in the 1910s and 20s and 30s was able to control. The person that I worked with, I did the map design, and the person I worked with, the geographer, has an amazing mind for being able to take a blank map and putting a dot where all these place names are and naming it, knowing accurately, reasonably accurately where they are. So we identified, so you can see here, black with serifs are Tibetan locations and place names, and brown and no serifs are Chinese place names. We've identified villages and towns, mountains, and most importantly, monasteries. Anybody can say that mountain is named such and such. No, it's not. It's named this other name. But the presence of a monastery is material evidence, and the founding of that monastery and its persistence in place over decades and centuries demonstrates a historical, cultural Tibet, because it's Tibetan Buddhism, regardless of the sect, and regardless of who in the early 1600s or the late 1200s or the late 1800s, regardless of who claimed to have political authority and control over the area. My colleague and I made a draft of the map, and Lodi contacted us one day and said that His Holiness would be in San Francisco. I lived in Berkeley at the time, and my colleague lived in Sacramento, lived an hour and a half away. And Lodi wanted us to present our draft of the map to His Holiness and have a conversation about it. So we did that. And the most important thing that His Holiness said, many important things, but the profound thing that he said was, can you incorporate history? Because we're talking about history. We're talking about these locations having a story to them, having an origin story of their founding, of their naming. In the back of the map is a long historical essay with 5 maps, each map a snapshot in time. The first 3 being the most important, showing the arrival, the establishment of a few town names and monastery names, then more, then more, then more. Again, regardless of what sect of Tibetan Buddhism it is. And I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Again, I've given to Geshe-la 3 pen drives with these 2 maps as digital on them, as well as the slides, all the slides. So those are to be distributed as he thinks appropriate. Now, as a side note, there's no line as a boundary here, because the line as a geopolitical tool to say, I'm in France and you're in Germany, like you're standing right there. There's a line there. That's a new invention among humans from the middle 1600s in Europe. Historically, there was no line. And so we had to figure out, how are we going to map this? And I used this gradient of color from green to lighter green into a light tan into a darker tan or a light brown, whatever you want to call it, to show a fading of one cultural landscape into a new one. So as you move east, and we all know this, as you go lower in elevation, as you move east, you're leaving prayer flags and chortens, and you're seeing, and think historically here, not modern Tibet and China, but 100 and 200 and 300 years ago. You're leaving a Tibetan landscape and arriving into a Han Chinese landscape, including with language. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Teichmann's book in just a few minutes, but I want to make a link between this idea of a comprehensive atlas of Tibet and some topics that I mentioned earlier, again, differentiated through Tibet on maps as made by outsiders. It's important to do as much research as we can to document those and to tell those stories, especially to a new generation of Tibetans, both as young students growing up and also young campaigners and activists, other young adults working on some aspect of furthering the cause of a free and independent Tibet. Okay. Ooh. Let's testing. Good? Okay. Good in the audience? Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to start with what I call the many variations of the shape of Tibet. Then there's an important question that it's not even fair for me as an outsider to propose it, but I think is important as a conversation to make clear about how to proceed with it. Is there a single correct boundary for Tibet? And do Tibetans need such a map? Does the world need such a map? That you can make arguments for and against. Again, that's not my discussion. I'm happy to participate or listen in on it, but not to lead it in any way at all. Over the years, I've collected something on the order of 50 pictures of maps of Tibet. And while I've not, there's a categorization or a taxonomy of them that doesn't make for lots of complicated categories, but I want to walk through 7 of them to show you what I'm talking about. So this is a map. It's from a screenshot when you watch Tibetan television news broadcasts. At the beginning of the news, there's this globe circling with Tibet, and if you time it just right, you'll get Tibet and take a screenshot. Notice the verticality here, and this V, and then how it drops off here. Okay, at Tibet Truth is convinced that this is the real map of Tibet, so we don't need any more maps. It's been amended for accuracy, that's good. Again, we have this drop down with a bit more coming southeast in here. That V is more heightened. Watch over here in the, it's not identified, but the Xining area. One of the sort of frustrating things about this map is that it's saying it's the real map of Tibet, but it uses China's borders for the Tibet Autonomous, what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, and for Qinghai and for Western Sichuan and far northern Yunnan. That's not how it should be mapped. It's not real. I mean, those boundaries are real today in a geopolitical power sense of convincing and coercing, but that's I'll come back to the, where does Amdo end and where does Kham begin? And the same with between Utsang and Kham and Amdo and Utsang. I have a cool idea about that. Here's another one from the Tibet Information Network. This is probably from the 80s or early 90s. We still have this vertical here, but that V has now become just sort of a U. There's this huge sort of peninsula of Gansu province coming into where Xining is. Okay. We now start to see, thankfully they amended it for accuracy. Okay, it's updated so that they think it's more accurate. But now look what's starting to happen. That vertical area is now turning into a sort of hypotenuse of a right triangle. Instead of this, it's now going like this, or from your perspective like this, it's now going like that. There's not that peninsula where Xining is. The border has been highly, highly generalized, which is perfectly fine in cartography. It's perfectly fine as long as you are explaining why you're generalizing it. In other words, you can have a river or a boundary that looks like this, like America's Mississippi River does this, and you can generalize that as long as you say, this is how we did it. It's okay to do. Oops. There's this map that you see around the area here. has now strongly become this sort of right triangle hypotenuse going from northeast to southwest. Same with this map, that's me in the corner. This is March last year in Ithaca, New York at the Namgyal Monastery Institute. A beautiful painting, just gorgeous, really, really beautiful. And a conception of what Tibet is in a geopolitical, cultural, historical sense. And this. Now, I'm interested in these questions. I'm not posing them because I think that these are the right questions. These are not, is there a definitive line, like I'm in Amdo and all of you are in Kham? Is there a definitive line that we can make in order to answer these questions about this sort of, this look of Tibet? The questions for me are, where is Tibet and what is it, that is, what is its spatial extent? What has Tibet been Tibet? That's a historical question. There's a very interesting thing here I'll show you from the Mapping Tibet book. There's 4 maps in it that engage this in a very small but important way. And then there's a really interesting sidebar I want to do in a few minutes. It's 4:45, and I'm going to drop out of here for just a minute to see what slide number I'm on. Okay, moving along. I'm going to skip over this. There's more than one way to think about what is Tibet as a meaningful, historical, and contemporary region on Earth defined by Tibetans. One curious one is to treat it first as a physiographic region, as the Tibetan Plateau. And because yaks and Tibetans are so closely bound together for so many centuries and millennia in their lives, that we can say the cultural environmental landscape of Tibet ends as you go lower in elevation where yaks can't live. So that's just looking at below 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters, or maybe it's 2,800 meters. As you go farther north, it might be lower still. But is that, it is a way to define this thing we call Tibet. Is that the best way? Is that the only way? And those are not questions for me to answer. I'd love to listen to people having that conversation. There's the changing spatial extent of Tibetan Buddhism. There's Tibet as a geopolitical territory, getting as far east as Xi'an province at one point, and I forget when that was in Tibet and China's history. There's an important corollary to this that I really want to share right now. So, China, and it relates to China's claim that Tibet has been a part of China since the Yuan dynasty. They also, so there's one map, there's another map. Neither of the maps is great cartographically, but they're useful in a very broad approximation of regional extent sense. The Chinese government has long argued that either that Tibet has always been a part of China or that Tibet has been a part of China since the Yuan dynasty, 1279 to 1368. We can dismiss one. Always been a part of, it's, I'm not going to, I don't want to curse. Number 2 may have some elements of truth in it, but at best incompletely true and distortions. Here's the argument that turns China's Yuan dynasty argument, that makes it meaningless. It's a fact that the Yuan dynasty in China's history is a Mongol invasion dynasty. The Mongols were there, not Chinese. The Mongols controlled. we can see that's circa 1290, so a decade or so into that control, it covers most of East and Central Asia. Second fact, at the same time, Tibet and Mongolia had established what we know to be as a patron-priest relationship, which was on a par with each other, like kings and a pope in Europe. They were different and complementing of each other, not higher or lower than. Another factor in the Yuan dynasty, Mongols advanced west across the Eurasian steppe, conquering lands that reached into today's Western Russia and not very far from today's Moscow. It's that map. I've added Moscow and I've added the word Tibet. They weren't that far from Moscow. The particular history the history of why that then faded, we don't need to get into that, but for the purposes of this argument, based on these facts and the fact that China has co-opted the Yuan dynasty as a Chinese dynasty, does China also claim most of Russia? If China claims that Tibet, because the Yuan dynasty had a relationship with the Tibetan plateau, does China also claim that most of today's Russia has always been a part of China or been a part of China since the Yuan dynasty? They wouldn't dare do that. They wouldn't dare say that. And yet they say it about Tibet. It's the same, and that they wouldn't dare say it about Russia is because of political power. This 6 maps, I thought it was 4, it's 6, appear here, which again raises the question of, at one point in Tibet's history, is making a map of Tibet, at what point will that map be situated in Tibet's history, of when it had an influence through Tibetan Buddhism and through militarism, through these changing regions? Okay, now to get to Eric Teichmann's book. I read this, I was in the area in mid-February to mid-March this year, and I was reading this book, and about a couple, 20 pages into it or so, I realized I needed to start underlining or identifying all of the towns. Let me back up. Eric Teichmann was a British consular office based in China, and he was sent into Kham because there were tensions among Tibetans and between Tibetans and Chinese, and he was sent to assess the situation and, if possible, help diffuse these tensions and negotiate treaties or truces, whatever word you want to use. I don't remember the exact, what his exact mandate was. This map also comes from the Mapping Tibet book. As I was reading, there are 5 or 7 or 8 maps in the book, and as I was reading, he's identifying village names and often identifying that there's a monastery nearby. I don't remember how often or rarely he was also identifying nunneries, but identifying monasteries, which gives further credence to the data as evidence on this map in these far regions of Eastern Kham. Now, in cartography, in map design, and in working with data, information, data doesn't have to be numbers. Here we have data that's qualitative. It's names of towns and names of monasteries, and often the sect of that monastery in the eastern part of historical cultural Tibet. In cartography, we can do 2 things here. We can use both different symbols, squares, circles, triangles, diamonds, to differentiate monasteries. We can also use colors. We could use circles for all 4 of these, and then a different color. And I've chosen colors randomly. I hope I've not offended anybody with a color that's inappropriate for your sect. We can use symbols and or colors. If we need to use these other symbols, if we use squares for monasteries like we did on this map and use triangles for mountains and then circles for towns, we can still have squares with different colors in them for each different sect. We can also show, if we don't have exact numbers or even approximate numbers, we can show relative sizes. If he says, this is a monastery that only has a few monks in it currently, we can change these numbers to low, moderate, high, or small, medium, large, something like that. But we can also map, and I'm using the red of the Gelugpa right now, we can map sizes of populations, as well as for a different sect. Again, the symbol type is secondary. It's the color that differentiates these. And so to take this map of place names, and maybe there's a few monasteries on here, and to populate to improve on this map just uses squares for monasteries. Now, if we continue with squares instead of circles, give them sizes based on evidence that the library has or some of the other offices here in the CTA have, and give them different colors. When I was starting to do this identifying of towns and monasteries, just putting a mark in the margin of the book, I realized that there's not one sect of Tibetan Buddhism out here in Eastern Kham. The idea being with whatever strength or weakness there was historically in the relations of Lhasa and these faraway monasteries, whatever their political relations, whatever their taxation willingness and unwillingness, whatever their loyalties were, there were still these different branches of Tibetan Buddhism this far east, making for, sort of countering the arguments that some scholars have made, was, well, Lhasa didn't really have much control over these areas. That didn't matter. I don't think, I mean, that matters in a lot of ways, but I think deeper than that is that Tibet is a Tibetan Buddhist history. And where these monasteries are, not just in what he identifies as part of Kham, and not just what we identified from the sort of eastern half of the Tibetan plateau as a historical cultural Tibet, but all of Tibet, doing this for all of Tibet, doing that for all of Tibet, making these historical snapshots in time maps of the arrival of a particular sect, the settlement, and the persistence on the landscape of this or that sect is a compelling way to say this is the history of the nation state of Tibet. Okay. The subsuming of poverties, what do I mean by that? You can use statistics, just numeric counts of people, and for example, median household income, to say that things are good in an area when in fact they're not, because when you average together lots of poor people with a few wealthy people, you get an area that looks okay. It's mainly middle class, for example. I've got more lists of colored bullet points. These three terms, Sustainable Development Index, Human Development Index, and Human Well-Being Index, we can treat those as synonymous. We can make an index. We can measure dimensions of social development, social well-being, social quality of life, education, cultural practices, language, religion, family planning, healthcare, freedom from personal or societal violence. There's freedom to do family planning. There's freedom to an appropriate, culturally appropriate education. And there's freedom from. We tend to not, especially in my country, we tend not to talk about freedom from kinds of freedoms. We can make a list of metrics, things to measure. Rank them 1 to 5, with 5 being high quality and 3, 2, or 1 being low to insufficient. Access to a living wage. Access to employment that's meaningful and culturally appropriate. Access to and control over. That's autonomy and self-determination. Having access to and control over these parts of your life, these are dimensions of genuine autonomy, in my opinion. And if you bring together 10 scholars on SDI and HDI and HWBI, they might say, no, there's 11 for social development, or 14, or 19. I used these 7, 7, 6, and 6 with my students, undergraduate students, as a starting point for thinking about what is quality of life. People self-assessing their quality of life. What did I just do here? Okay, those just move slightly. Every one of these can be considered a form of poverty. We tend to think of poverty of not having enough money in your pocket, or not having a job that pays well enough, and you're right at the edge of not having enough, of having an insufficient. Poverty means insufficient access to and control over, and in that blank you can put any one of these 26 criteria. Again, so another scholar will come along and say, no, there's 34 of them. Okay, sure. Not to debate. As a starting point for conversation, each of these dimensions relates to autonomy and self-determination of a person, of a family, of a community, of a larger community in a larger region. Access to and control over means that I am determining my own fate and future for myself, for my family, as a member of a village or a town or in a city. Now, I'm about to change these as metrics of well-being to metrics of justice. When a person or a family or a village, a town, a community, when they can comfortably say that they have sufficient access to and control over any one of these dimensions, that's fair. It may not be perfect, they would like more, sure, but that's a measure of justice. And in the context of Tibetans, it's a measure of having a modicum amount or a sufficient amount of autonomy and self-determination in deciding their own fate and future. Again, as individuals, as families, as townships and villages and so on. I'm going to skip fuzzy borderlands. It's a really cool thing, but we're running out of time. All of these topics, to me, are a foundation. It's not a comprehensive list. It's a list that interests me. All of these topics constitute dimensions of what I call a comprehensive atlas of Tibet. Such an atlas has 3 distinct and overlapping audiences. One, of course, is the People's Republic of China. In fact, the government, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party and leadership in Beijing. For this audience, this is a resistance atlas. It's an atlas of dissent, grounded in dissent and saying, no, you're wrong. Here are the facts, including using social and economic demographic data from China's own censuses over decade over decade over decade to find these disparities. Maybe some of the data will show, yes, relatively speaking, there have been improvements in Tibetan communities that are now controlled by China. But we can also say, have they improved as much as the quality of life measures of Chinese in those same communities? In other words, Have the Tibetans increased in quality of life like that, but the Chinese are like that, faster, with better quality of life? The data will show that. And we need to be honest about what we find from the data. But we need to find that data and do those analyses. The second, excuse me, the second audience is for the rest of the world. It's an audience, for this audience, it's an atlas that is speaking truth to power. It's an empowerment atlas. And finally, and most of all, it's an atlas for the Tibetan people, both in Tibet and in exile. For those in Tibet, it's an atlas of hope. We know what you're going through. Here's the larger story, more comprehensively than you've known before. In exile, it's an atlas that empowers especially children. I wanted to get pictures of children, but you see, this is just outside the museum. I think that's all I have. Yeah, thank you. 5:05. No worries.
So I think we will stop here. And the choice and itinerary. So you can clearly see how complex it is to do an authentic mapping of Tibet.
But it is doable.
It is doable.
It is doable. It's not
So
short term.
this presentation of authentic mapping of Tibet also shows authenticating Tibet in general through multifarious ways. And that authentication can be done through saying no to what is wrong. No to what is wrong. Right? So the resistance.
Dissent.
Yes. So
The human right to say no.
Exactly. So thank you very much for this amazing presentation.
I'll stick around. Can I stick? Can we?
Yes.
We have the room still, so I'll stick around if you have questions you want to ask. I'm happy to answer questions.